Welcome everyone. We have a lot of our regulars and a couple of newcomers here. I'm glad to have you. The thing I'm trying to, we have this Thursday is a book club. We'll talk more about that later at 8 o'clock via Zoom. But tonight, I want to just mention a couple of things before I introduce our speaker. One, please mute yourself when the speaker is trying to get the slides up. And it's always a challenge sometimes to do that. But we'll technically, we're going to make all the bad stuff happen to Peter tonight. So it's going to be all right. And if you wish to see the slide and the speaker's head, just go up to the upper right where it says view. And when you click that and hit speaker, all you'll get is whatever is showing on the shared screen and the speaker's head. Otherwise, you're going to get a little film strip of 4 or 5 people if you have that gallery. And other than that, let me tell you about tonight's presenter. We have with us to illumine us Bill Humber. Bill is a retired university professor and a widely recognized baseball historian, an active member of the 19th Century Committee. Bill has often spoken at this series and at the Fred conferences. I mean, who can forget his cricket talk when he took a cricket bat to demonstrate how a cricket batter handles a wicket googly. But Bill is the author of numerous books on baseball, which contributed to his selection to the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame. He was also awarded the Order of Canada for his contribution to the culture of Canada. Tonight, his talk is on Baseball Goes International, and we welcome Bill Humber. Bill, if you would like you to hit the share screen and bring your slides up, we're ready to go.
Wonderful. And let me just take them from the beginning. There we go.
Well, okay, you're good.
Are they showing?
You're good.
Good, excellent. Thanks a lot, Bob, and thanks for those who've tuned in tonight. Again, this is a story that's kind of intrigued me for quite a while. The nature of baseball as an international game. If we think long and hard about it, it always really has had an international character to it. We know that David Block wrote about an English baseball form of baseball in Germany. We know the references to baseball in England in the 18th century. We know Northanger Abbey has references to baseball. We're not really quite sure what the baseball was, what they were playing, but we have a good sense that the game has a long heritage in places other than the United States and I would argue Canada. And of course, these two gentlemen on the first slide say as much about international baseball as we can possibly say. Ohtani, obviously, on the left. But Freddie Freeman, the World Series MVP, has played not once, but twice for Canada in the World Baseball Classic. And that was to honor his mother, who was from Peterborough, Ontario, and who died when he was 10 years of age. His father is also from Canada, originally from Windsor. Freddie Freeman, of course, is an American citizen. He doesn't have Canadian citizenship, as far as I know, but he has chosen and elected to play for Canada in the World Baseball Classic because the rules, as it were, of playing internationally in some respects follow those that they use in soccer, where you can go back as far as your grandparents and determine the country that you would like to represent. And so in effect, he was able to take advantage of that opportunity in representing Canada in the World Baseball Classic. And we certainly weren't going to turn him down in doing so. So internationally, of course, when we think back to the that's, by the way, the last reference to the 21st century I'll make. I'll just skip by the 20th century and go right into the 19th century. We're all familiar, of course, with Spalding's extraordinary world tour of 1888-89. Ostensibly, one of the reasons was he brought out a new shoe called the Kangaroo and thought it might be a good idea to go to Australia to show off the shoe at least, or at least to get some promotion around that. But I still argue that one of the great photos of all time is this photo from the Sphinx in Egypt, where the ball players managed to make do with climbing on top of the Sphinx and having their photograph taken. And of course, one of the accounts of that game suggests that they also tried to throw a ball over the Sphinx and managed to knock chips out of it, out of this Egyptian relic. In a certainly an example of bad taste, if there ever was one, but still, in my mind, there is a tad amusing side to all of this. And of course, before that, the famous tour of the Boston Red Stockings to England in 1874. Once again, ostensibly to introduce baseball, but baseball, of course, in some form was already recognized as a game being played at essentially, it's not definitively, but essentially at a juvenile level. If one looks back to the 18th century, cricket became, as it were, the dominant bat and ball game. And many other of these bat and ball games either withered away or became kind of regionally focused, but it lost their attraction, or simply became kids' games. I mean, if one talks to Brits to this day, they'll often say something to the effect that, "Oh, baseball, that's a game that young girls play at the beach on bank holidays called rounders." And of course, very little could be true about that in terms of comparing those young girls playing rounders to modern baseball, but nevertheless, that's a perception that survives. Well, we owe the credit for the recognition of the first international game to Joe Overfield. Joe was a wonderful early historian of the game. He shared with me and many of us, I'm sure, who are on this tonight, are with us tonight, his tremendous knowledge of the game and his tremendous collection of materials associated with the game. He gave to me a box score of a game between London Tecumseh, and the Buffalo baseball team from 1877. He shared happily letters that had been exchanged between representatives of baseball teams in Canada and in the United States. He even came once to my baseball class at Seneca College. He made the trip up. And he was just a wonderful man in terms of his help, I guess is the best way to describe it. So this item he referenced in 1964 in a publication called Niagara Frontier, and he indicated that it was the first international match that could be determined to be international in the sense of involving teams from two separate jurisdictions and teams that were indeed baseball teams per se. Intriguingly, it has received or did receive very, very little recognition after that fact. One might have thought that something deemed to be the first international game would have had at least a semblance of kind of recognition and understanding and reporting about and commentary about. But that really wasn't the case for many years. Even SABR's book, Inventing Baseball, did not mention this game. And I think that's kind of a shame because, in effect, this is, I think we can acknowledge now, what we would describe as the first international game. Intriguingly enough, the teams that were involved, the Queen Cities of Buffalo and the Burlingtons of Hamilton, were, I think one could say fairly, that they were the second teams in town. the Niagaras of Buffalo appear to be, and were the stronger team in Buffalo. The young Canadians, later the Maple Leafs, as they were called, of Hamilton, were both the first team in Hamilton, formed in 1854, but also the stronger of the two teams and the one that had a longer life. And in fact, the Burlingtons would eventually join the young Canadians and become what became known as the Hamilton Maple Leaf team. So this is the general area in which that ball game took place. We can be fairly certain it was somewhere in the vicinity of the suspension bridge, which in and of itself was a remarkable feat of engineering. It was built in the mid 19th century. It's extraordinary to think of how do they ever got these managed to put the technology, as it were, in place to make this bridge possible. They had none of the things we might take for granted today. They had to throw ropes across the river. They had to do a lot of extraordinary things, and they had to and you can see too, they had two levels to the bridge. It was quite a kind of a revolutionary thing in its time. On the top level being for trains, and on the bottom level for pedestrians or horse-drawn carriages or whatever. And indeed, this description, which I won't read because you can read it yourself, explains that essentially the other challenge they faced is that the track gauges on the Canadian and the American side were of different sizes. Just to add to the thrill of trying to have a train, and there were a number of American as well as Canadian-based trains that passed through this area. As you can see, the Great Western Railway was the Canadian, but the New York Central and the New York and Erie were the American. And you can even see another one of the kind of anomalies of language in North America. In Canada, we call them railways. In the United States, they're called railroads. So there's these small little differences as reflected perhaps in the track gauge and the means that they had to make it, in fact, possible for those trains to cross from one side to the other. And we can be pretty certain of the location of the game because as the news account says, it was in a place called Clifton. And you can see certainly in the top right-hand corner of the picture of the kind of pinkish picture on your left, the suspension bridge showing where, in fact, that's located. And you can see very clearly that it comes into a place called Clifton. And it's somewhat up the river, as it were, from Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls shows up kind of in the yellow picture. You can see the general vicinity of the falls and Goat Island, not as clearly in the pink one, but the location was very clear as to where it was. It was in a place called Clifton, and in some ways it shouldn't have been that hard to find, but it was. It was it would become a popular location thanks in some respects to this woman, Theodosia Burr. And Theodosia was the daughter of Aaron Burr. And Aaron Burr, of course, was the man who made the musical Hamilton possible. I suppose if he and Hamilton hadn't decided to shoot it out, perhaps there would be no such thing. Who knows? There might be a musical, there might not be a musical. But Theodosia got married in the early 19th century, 1801, and she and her husband, extraordinarily, set out with, as you can see there, a team of staff and pack horses on their wedding journey to Niagara Falls. And of course, as this states in this particular account, it wasn't long before other well-heeled newlyweds were making similar trips. So throughout the 19th century, Niagara Falls became a destination, as it were, for newlyweds. So much so that in 1882, Oscar Wilde, on his tour of North America, went to Niagara Falls. And you may or may not be familiar with what he had to say about Niagara Falls, and I will say it as well, I won't say it like he would have said it, but I'll say it as delightfully as he might have intoned. When a young married bride finds that Niagara Falls is her second greatest disappointment in life. That was Oscar Wilde on the charms of Niagara Falls for newlyweds. But it was also a significant location because here Harriet Tubman and at least two accredited accounts did bring escaped slaves across the river, across the bridge, as it were, into Canada, into Clifton. The picture on your right is obviously a contemporary photo that or image that's been created to reflect, in a sense, the sensibility of that area. But we have a pretty good sense that Niagara Falls Suspension Bridge area became the location of a large Black community in Canada. And we might also assume that they might have been, some of them might have been spectators at the game in 1860, that first international game. And the reason I say that is because in 1869, just 9 years later, London, Ontario, puts on a baseball tournament, and they have a special class, as they call it, but it's a special class for what they describe as colored teams. And they receive inquiries from the cities in Ontario of Hamilton, St. Catharines, and the Suspension Bridge. And those inquiries were from obviously from baseball teams in 1869 that were considering participating in the London tournament. Well, none of them did, as it turned out. In fact, only two teams competed in the London tournament. London's primary Black team was the Lincoln Nine, but they didn't even compete. Another team, it appears that they may have been railway porters, did compete for London, and they competed against a team from Detroit, the Rialtos. So one could say that that game was the first international game played by two all-Black teams. Another kind of first that was happened in Ontario. Now there are a few, contenders, as it were, for the title of international game. Porter's Spirit of the Times had this description of an international baseball match at Rochester in 1859. It's probably fair to say that while indeed they did play baseball, they were not baseball teams per se, nor did they represent different international jurisdictions. Yes, they were made up of players that were from different countries, but that was kind of irrelevant to the title of what might be classified as an international match. Lillywhite and Lockyer were two English cricketers and were notable for being running both teams. As a small aside, Godfrey Phipps Baker, who hit a home run in the game, Andrew North has rather amusingly referred to him as perhaps the original home run Baker. He was a Ottawa area postmaster who managed to get himself into the lineup of John Lillywhite's team. What is peculiar about and I can't explain it, is that while the Lillywhite's team had 27 men shown as out, Lockyer's side, if you were to do the math on it, shows 29. And I'm not sure what the reason for that was. Who knows? Maybe they gave them a couple of extra men at bat just to I don't know, to make, try to make up the 17-7 score as it was then in John Lillywhite's side's favor. This is the other possibility. This was in the New York paper in 1860 in Schenectady. I think I pronounced that right. And it talks about New York versus Canada and a Union Club of Upper Canada. Well, thanks to Bob Folks, who has gone deep into the papers for that era, it's quite clear now that the two teams were both local teams, and one of them had decided for whatever reason to adopt the name of Canada for their identity. Much as you might say kids teams today adopt identities of Major League Baseball teams, or for that matter, international identities, which have little or nothing to do with the nature of the team, but sound good, I guess, for want of a better term, or at least are kind of appropriate to their interest in the sport. So we're left with the game in Clifton. And I do like this New Yorker cartoon. I don't know if you can read it or not, but I'll read it for those who have trouble reading it. He says to her, "You seem familiar, yet somehow strange. Are you by any chance Canadian?" I don't know how she responded to that, but I should say that the match in Clifton did cause some angst within the early ranks of SABR, because it was hard for, I think, some researchers at least to believe that the first international baseball game could have been played anywhere but in the United States. It just seemed beyond the realm of belief. So some of the early writing in around 2010 and thereabouts suggests, well, we've looked around Buffalo and we really can't find anything comparable to Clifton. You know, there seemed to be a something in Erie, Pennsylvania that might have been, you know, comparable to that title. Well, in fact, all they needed to do was to cross, and eventually that's what happened, cross the Niagara River into Canada. And just to put this in its proper perspective, the first ever international ice hockey game, which most Canadians would probably assume was played in Canada. No, it wasn't. It was played in Burlington, Vermont. And they very nicely put up a plaque to it. By the way, there is no plaque for the first international baseball game in Canada, but there is a plaque in Burlington, Vermont for the first ever international hockey game in the 1886. So, should it have been hard to find Clifton? Well, not really. If one went back into the New York Clipper the year before, they talked extensively. They had box scores, they had reports in at least two different papers about the Clifton of Clifton CW playing the St. George Club of Buffalo. And the Clifton CW, CW stands for Canada West. That was the name of Ontario between 1841 and 1867. And I would, you know, I have to point out that the Canada West that they describing was essentially Southern Ontario. There was no Northern Ontario. There was nothing west of Lake Superior. The Canada West did not include Manitoba through British Columbia. No, it was Southern Ontario. Whereas Canada East was what was referred to as Quebec. And nor did it include any of the Atlantic provinces of Canada, or for that matter, Newfoundland. So it can be confusing, I understand, to people to look at this and try to make sense of it. But as I say, the year before, Clifton was well advertised as being the place in which the game occurred. As I mentioned, the Burlingtons were the team that was sent. They were not a new team. They may have been new to the New York rules. The New York game is first played in Ontario, it appears, in May 1859, but they had well organized teams going back to 1854. And I make the argument, and I suppose we could argue this forever, that level of organization was profound, that it in fact provided a easy landing place, as it were, for the New York rules, which in my mind were frankly better rules than the old-fashioned game, which had two major features to it that we know. One being the plugging, or throwing the ball at the runner between bases to retire him, and the other being the 360-degree circumference in which a lot of these games were played. So there was a long, well-established history of even baseball earlier than 1854, but the formality of early organization in 1854 and 1855 was such that is kind of comparable to when we see teams starting to form in other parts of the United States, and even finally when the New York game begins to kind of attract attention beyond the Knickerbockers and other teams in New York City. We know that there are a lot of there isn't a lot of records. There are records of baseball play, but not a lot of records until about the middle of the decade. So what was the big attraction? Do you think everybody in Hamilton and Buffalo were getting really excited about this first international game? Well, possibly not. We can clearly see in this sign for this advertisement in the Hamilton Spectator of the 9th of August, 1860, that everyone was getting kind of excited about going to the suspension bridge. The suspension bridge was the terminus, as it were, of the railway that was coming out of Hamilton. And for a half a buck, half a dollar, you could get on the train and go down for the day and go back at night. And you might have thought, wow, that would have been kind of exciting. You know, you could go down and watch the first international baseball game. Well, maybe not so fast, because of this two people. One of them was a guy named Blondin, a Frenchman who famously was known for his high wire act. He was probably the most prominent of the high wire walkers of his era. He loved to go across the Niagara River and demonstrate his prowess. He wore peculiar costumes. I won't comment on his outfit that he's wearing. It certainly is a little different than one would normally wear, even in those days. Um, he had a Mark Twain did not like him. Let me put it that way. Mark Twain referred to him when he finally took over the Buffalo paper in 1869 as that adventurous ass. He was not a big fan of Blondin, but Blondin had the name, had the reputation, and had everything kind of going for him. But he did have a rival, and that rival was a guy named Farini, Signor Farini, who passed himself off as an Italian nobleman and who was kind of, if there was a crowd favorite amongst these two, it was probably Farini because he bought the rope, about 2,000 feet of it, that would eventually extend across the river. He bought it in Buffalo. So he liked to buy locally. He was considered kind of as I say, a local favorite. Um, and he attracted the ladies. Sometimes that was not a good thing for the ladies, though. There's a famous account of Farini in one of his high wire acts of having his wife in a chair that he was balancing as they went across the high wire, and he had warned her, if for any reason I start to move about, do not move yourself because I need to know where the weight is and I can adjust to it. Sadly, when he did start to get the jitters, as it were, or certainly had a problem on the wire, she panicked and started moving all over the place. He grabbed her coat or her dress as she fell past him, but he was unable to hold it, and she fell to her doom. So he, as I say, was the second great attraction. We definitely know he was there on the 17th of August when the first international baseball game was played. But Signor Farini, it turns out, wasn't actually Signor Farini from Italy. He was actually a guy named Bill Hunt. And he actually grew up around the block from where I now live on what is now called Lover's Lane in Bowmanville. And what I'm showing you is Beach Avenue, and the houses on the right in Farini's time were not there. It was an open field. It was used for cricket matches. It's where the Darlington Cricket Club played. But circuses would come through town and set themselves up as for the 1 day or 2 days that they were in town. And on one occasion, they actually set up a kind of a tightrope walking opportunity. And Bill Hunt went on this tightrope walking opportunity and was so enamored with it that he became the noted tightrope walker of certainly as a rival to Blondin in that particular period. And he was definitely there on the 17th. The Buffalo papers are full in their accounts. Some accounts say that Blondin was there as well on the 17th, but I've not been able to verify that as being actually the case. But you could see there's the suspension bridge, and as it crosses from the Canada to the American side, you can see all the Niagara Falls as we know them today, and that is Mr. Farini on the bars. So the game was it was close. It was 30-25. The New York game had come to the Buffalo Rochester area probably a couple of years before it finally made its way into Ontario. So there's probably not much doubt that the players had longer on the Niagaras and the Queen Cities to play the game by those rules. That was but they picked it up quickly. They were playing a form of baseball in Ontario. So but Paul Langendorfer very generously sent me a note from the Niagara record book that the Canadians had purchased a ball from the Buffalo Club, and we don't really know who the ball was or why they purchased it, who purchased it. But it's a pretty good bet. It was the people in Hamilton had bought it. They'd been to Buffalo in 1858 to kind of scout out the new game and to kind of get a feeling for what these new rules were all about. And so it wasn't really a big surprise in 1860 that they now these teams had come over to the New York rules game as well. The young Canadians, as they were known, were from Hamilton. William Shuttleworth was their catcher and kind of their major man, president of the club. They got beaten, well beaten, in the first game they played, 87-13, to the Niagaras. They did somewhat better in the second game, only losing 46-15, though it only went 8 innings. I'm not really sure why. But they set in motion now the process by which international baseball could be played. And of course, through the 1860s and 70s, Canadian teams would often go south of the border to play matches with different teams in the United States. American teams, most notably the Boston Red Stockings, came through Canada on multiple occasions. They always did very well. They always kind of slaughtered the locals, as it were. In fact, I remember writing a story for the World Series magazine in 1993. Oh, there I went back to the 19th century, 20th century, saying that it had taken a long time for Toronto to get their revenge on the Red Stockings. Of course, by then they were the Atlanta Braves, because when they'd come through Toronto, and I've forgotten the score now, but it was something like 80-1 or 60-1. It was, shall we say, an embarrassment for the Toronto baseball team when they came through in the 1870s. That was finally made up for when the Toronto Blue Jays won in 1992. It took a long time, but international baseball was off and running, and in some respects inspired, I think, probably the tour up to England by the Boston Red Stockings and the Wright brothers, and set in motion maybe some of those other events that Spalding would inspire as well. So a lot of this is going to be in a book that is imminent. If Andrew North is on the line, he could probably give a little bit more detail, but it's a lot of this is going to be covered in a book that's coming out called Old Ontario at Bat, Baseball's Unheralded Ancestry, which is currently at the printer, as I understand it, and to be printed and distributed by the Center for Canadian Baseball Research. And the international game plays a part in that conversation. And thank you very much.
Bill,
Stop my share. There I am.
there you are, just living color. I forgot to mention that you can use the chat, but we do have Karen, if you'd unmute yourself and ask your question, she raised her hand.
Yep.
Go ahead.
I'm a teacher, so that's what I do. I just want to let you know, it's not a real baseball thing, but my cousin, Ann Edson Taylor, was the first person to go over the Niagara Falls in a barrel.
Ah.
And survived.
Nice.
That was a popular kind of event, was it? I mean, it happened several dozen times, didn't it?
There's a whole museum up there about it.
Yeah.
It was on her 63rd birthday. She wanted to do something that nobody had done it before.
And she lived to tell the story?
Yes.
Wow. Yeah.
Bill, I have a question about the relationship between Canada and England and baseball, because so much of Canada were obviously of English stock, as was America for that same reason. But there was much more close ties,
yes,
economically and culturally, between Canada and England. Did the Canadians have any of the same attitude toward baseball that the English seemed to have? It's a kid's game, or the other side of that is, why did it become acceptable in Canada?
It's kind of a lengthy answer. I wish I could answer. It takes about 400 pages to explain it in the book, but I think the essence of it is that Canadians were involved in the early stages of the game alongside Americans. And there was less kind of a sense that somehow you're playing a kid's game. There was less kind of worry that somehow this was juvenile. And I think the other factor, and this would be, I'm sure we could have a lot of debate about this one, but given that cricket was a 18th century game, it takes a long time for it to become formalized in North America. And there are many factors for that. It's a new society. There's a lot of wars going on in the, 18th, early 19th century. And, the time and effort that's required to invest in the infrastructure necessary for a very formal game like cricket, it isn't there to the same extent. And baseball is a kind of an easier game to pick up and play because it doesn't have a lot of, it doesn't have a lot of formality to it. It doesn't have a lot of infrastructure that's required. You could just go out and play it and run around and throw a ball and hit a ball. And so cricket is not far enough advanced as a bat and ball game in North America to supersede or ensure forever that baseball can never rise to that level of popularity as cricket does. It may I argued it has cricket maybe have a 15 to 20 year at most head start on baseball. And again, I would argue it's not long enough for the game institutionally to take hold in that way. The other thing that's intriguing, of course, is that the baseball that comes into Canada in the late 18th, early 19th century, I would argue, is not American baseball as yet. It's still a kind of an English European folk custom. And so it's picked up here in its early rudimentary form. And it evolves here alongside the way it's evolving in the United States through what I would call a proto-modern stage. And what that means essentially is that we're kind of experimenting with the game in the same way that Americans are experimenting with it, which allows the game to kind of parallel in many respects its development south of the border. And it's always been one of I have two problems with kind of the history of baseball. One is that American historians, baseball historians, have virtually played no kind of role in looking at the baseball across the border, of crossing the border and seeing what was happening here through the first 50 years of the 19th century. And part of the result of that is the first international game in Clifton is overlooked for a long time just because of the fact that it doesn't happen in the United States. The other factor, though, is a Canadian factor, where very early by the 1860s, Canadians are claiming this American game and we're becoming Americanized, and isn't it a shame that, we're playing the game that, people south of the border, why can't we play cricket or why can't we play lacrosse? Well, in my mind, it's an absurd comment. We were part of growing and developing the game. One of the most extraordinary finds I've had of recent times is discovering a game in Goderich, Ontario, which is on Lake Huron, in 1848, playing something called baseball, BASS ball, which of course is the same spelling they used for the game that King George was playing, as a child back in 100 years before, with his father, the Prince of Wales. And it argues that the form of the nature of the early game of baseball that came into Canada definitely came up from the United States with early United Empire loyalists and other land seekers. But again, what they brought was not an American game. It was a English European game, but it was also coming into Canada from an English source as well. It was no question that there are enough number of examples of a ball player, one form or another, having an allegiance. And in a way, there's two accounts, at least in Canada. Now, I told you it was a long answer. There are at least two accounts in Canada in which they refer to that baseball as basically as a long ago form of something that was played in Merry England. And if you actually look at the history of Merry England, it's something that actually precedes the Protestant Reformation. And you can go way back in English history and find this whole period of play where games like stool ball and Northern Trap and a whole bunch of other games were being played that eventually subsided, disappeared, whatever. But in some ways, those old antique games still had some resonance and made them their way into Canada.
So,
Sorry for that long-winded answer.
you would also have the demographic idea of proximity being kind of being contiguous with the United States, therefore a lot of interplay back and forth.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the arguments I make, why are there two different forms of football in North America, Canadian and American? Well, Canada had more, and you used the term, had more access to Britain. And so they had access to rugby rules. They had people that could teach them the game, et cetera, et cetera. There was less connection in the United States. So very quickly, the rules transformed in the United States to the game that is essentially gridiron football today. And Canadians retained many aspects of that old rugby style, even to the contemporary game in Canada, still has many elements that would appear to be like old rugby is. Yes, in 95% of the case, the game that's played in Canada is essentially identical with the four down game that's played in the United States, but there are still rule variations. Recently, the Toronto Argonauts won a game where they kicked a ball out of the end zone, and that entitled them to a single point, or a rouge, as they say in football. It was the last play of the game. They didn't have to kick the field goal. All they had to do was kick the single point, and they got a single point for it.
Very good. Eddie North put a comment in the chat. Old Ontario at Bat is going to the printers this week. It will most assuredly be available at the Fred, and I assume through normal channels in North America. We have a question from Ken Kirk. I assume this is the suspension bridge. I assume this is not the bridge that Ed Delahanty fell from.
No, I don't think so. No. That bridge, I think, was there from about 1850 to about 1890 or thereabouts. Yeah, I think it was, there have been many bridges there, yeah.
Okay, all right. Let's see what else.
Hey, I've got a comment and two questions, if that's okay for you, Bill.
Yeah, go ahead.
First of all, you mentioned it was a couple years before, so I just came across the 1857 bylaws and rule book for the Niagaras. So they were doing New York ball by 1857 for sure.
Right, makes sense.
So the other question I had is about the bridge and about Clifton itself. So one of those pictures that looked like was it sitting in front of where the Bridal Falls was, or whereabouts was the actual suspension bridge?
Well, it was somewhat downriver, a couple of miles downriver, and it was right into the village of what was then called Clifton.
Right.
Clifton was the name of that village, as it were. Drummondville, I believe, was south of it. They all became part of what was called Niagara Falls, Canada, in the 1880s. They didn't change their name until then. And I think they did it partly because they realized all these tourists were coming to the area and we're all going to the American side, because the Americans called it Niagara Falls, New York, right? Whereas they came to the Canadian side and it was called Clifton and Drummondville, and they were confused. So they finally said, you know what, let's just call it Niagara Falls, Canada.
Well, that was actually my next question. I was going to ask you if Clifton was what is Clifton Hill now? So that whole area
Clifton
at the
Hill
top is Clifton Hill.
Clifton Hill is the remnant name from that period
Okay.
of time. Yeah, that's the only remnant that survives.
Clifton Hill is like a miniature version of Las Vegas in Canada. It's pretty awful, but it's a see it once.
Yes, I know that they have a famous wax museum there where they actually built a replica of the Charles Manson killings. And I thought, boy, talk about bad taste. This is, this is outrageous.
We have a comment from Pam Baker. Unfortunately, this is talking about the Canadian, not Canadian, the English-American relationship. Unfortunately, there was resistance to things English in America until World War I. Even then, our soldiers called the British redcoats.
Yeah.
That may be why we have some hole in our knowledge.
Yeah. I mean, I could make a joke that Benedict Arnold is a hero in Canada. I wouldn't, but I could make a joke about that. One of the things I would say, and there's an argument that cricket lost out because of its Englishness. Well, I think I would strongly argue against that point of view, because if any place is English, it's Southern Ontario. our our flag of Ontario still has a Union Jack in it. Our major May holiday, often referred to as May 2-4 weekend, is still called Victoria Day. Our concession road system is, based on that kind of British layout of the road system. So it is a area that is deeply, particularly in the 19th century, and particularly after the rebellion of 1837, which the rebels lost. And as a result of that, the British influence and the English identity was even more strongly in place after that point. Yet, despite all of that, cricket fades and baseball is the dominant game in Ontario.
Do we have any other questions? Just go
Yeah, I
ahead.
have a
and,
question.
yes, go.
Yeah, this is for Bill.
Yeah.
What was the name of the bridge that Ed Delahanty died off of?
I don't know. I can't answer that. Sorry. I know it was one of those that crossed from one side to the other, but I'm not sure what the name of it is.
No, because he said something about 1850 to 1890, and he died in 1903.
Yeah, that's my point. That it was another bridge, not the suspension bridge that he fell off of. I think that suspension bridge as such was gone by then, and they built another bridge. There's a couple of Paul, how many bridges are there in that general area now?
Oh, suspension
3.
bridge is it was around between 1850 and 1890. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, yes, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah.
3 is to answer your question.
Yeah.
Peace Bridge, Rainbow, and Lewiston is up there now.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions or comments anybody would like to add to the discussion? All right.
Well,
Bill,
just
thank you.
if I may, to underline Bill's assertion about the British nature of Southern Ontario, I'm speaking to you at this moment from my home in London, Ontario.
As opposed to London, Kentucky, which I knew many people. Yeah, there's a lot of towns that pick that up, but I imagine those were colonial artifacts in a lot of ways, Scarborough and those sort of things.
Yeah.
Bill, thank you.
Okay,
It's
thank
a
you.
fascinating situation, trying to nail down the first international game and look at other contenders, and then trying to understand how that happened and all. Thank you very much for your talk. We do appreciate it. Next month, in the speakers series, I'm trying to recall, I just had an exchange with him, Vince Camarillo. He's going to be talking about Charles Fisher. Charles Fisher is the only Major League Baseball player buried in Alaska. And he has done some research with the historical people in Eagle, Alaska, which is not too far from the border with Yukon. It's in the Fairbanks borough, but well away from it was a former military site. Fort Egbert was there, and that will be next the second Tuesday of December, and we will look forward to seeing you. This Thursday, Larry Dake will be the moderator of the book club session. Most of you should have received a message through the SABR messaging system from me, questions that Larry has developed as part of to stimulate some of the discussion. But he is going to moderate a discussion on baseball in the Garden of Eden by John Thorne. Going to be very, very interesting. I see a number of comments for Bill and being an interesting talk, but we also have from Justin McKinney, the guru of Union Association. He lets me know that Charles Fisher was a Union. He played 1 year, 1884, in the Union Association. So we'll learn something about that also. Thank you all. We appreciate your coming. We will see you if we don't see you before the December speaker series, or not then, have a wonderful holiday, a nice Thanksgiving for the Americans, and Christmas will be coming in late December. Have a good night. Thanks, everyone.
Great.